It started with a moment, a simple, fleeting moment that could have passed unnoticed, like so many others in the chaos of everyday life. But fate has a way of turning the smallest gestures into the grandest stories. And this story, this incredible, unbelievable story, began with nothing more than a boy's small act of kindness. Jake wasn't the kind of kid most people paid attention to. At 14, he was quiet, observant, and often lost in his own world. He wasn't the star athlete, the class clown, or the troublemaker. He was just Jake. The kid who sat near the window in class, who never quite fit in but never stood out enough to be bullied either. Life at home wasn't great, but it wasn't terrible. His mom worked 2 jobs, and his dad had been gone for years. They got by, even if it meant wearing the same worn-out sneakers for another year and pretending not to hear when the landlord knocked a little too hard on the door. Jake wasn't the kind of kid who expected much out of life, and then, one cold afternoon, everything changed. It happened in the middle of New York City, right in front of a towering hotel where the rich and famous walked in and out like it was just another ordinary place. Jake had been there by accident. He wasn't supposed to be anywhere near Fifth Avenue. He was just killing time before heading home, wandering past the stores he could never afford to step inside. He liked watching the world move, imagining what it was like to belong in a place where people didn't worry about rent or dinner or whether their coat would last another winter. That's when he saw him, Barron Trump. Most people knew who he was, even if they didn't follow politics. Being the son of a former president made sure of that. But here on the sidewalk, surrounded by bodyguards who looked more like statues than people, Barron didn't seem like the larger-than-life figure the media made him out to be. He looked, well, normal. Just another teenager caught in a world that expected too much of him, and then something unexpected happened. As Barron stepped out of the hotel, a strong gust of wind ripped a piece of paper from his hand, a simple sketch, one he had been holding onto carefully. It wasn't a document or a bill, just a small drawing, something personal, and before he could react, it was already tumbling down the sidewalk, caught in the current of the busy city. Jake saw it happen. He saw the flicker of disappointment in Barron's eyes, the hesitation, as if he wanted to chase after it but knew his security wouldn't let him. Maybe it was just a drawing. Maybe it wasn't important. But something about the way Barron watched it fly away made Jake move before he could think. He ran. The streets of New York weren't kind to things that got lost. 1 second too late, and something was gone forever, trampled, crushed, or picked up by someone who wouldn't think twice before tossing it away. But Jake had quick feet, and more importantly, he had a feeling. A feeling that this mattered, even if he didn't know why. Darting between the crowd, dodging the rush of people who didn't care about a single loose piece of paper, Jake reached out, just as the drawing threatened to disappear into the street. His fingers grasped the edge, crumpling it slightly, but he had it. He turned back, heart pounding. Barron was still there, watching. And when Jake walked up and handed the drawing back, something shifted, not just in the air, but in Barron's expression. "Thanks," Barron said, his voice quieter than Jake expected. "No problem," Jake replied, shrugging like it was nothing. But it wasn't nothing. Because in that moment, Barron Trump, someone whose life was worlds apart from Jake's, really looked at him. Not in the way people glanced at strangers before moving on, but in a way that made it clear something had changed. A connection had been made. Jake didn't know it yet, but that single act of kindness was about to turn his entire life upside down. Because sometimes, fate doesn't just knock. Sometimes it storms in without warning, and nothing is ever the same again. As he walked away from the hotel, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. That moment, Barron looking at him like he was more than just another face in the crowd, lingered in his mind. Life went on as usual. The walk home was the same. The streetlights flickered just like they always did. His apartment still smelled like old wood, and his mom's tired sighs still filled the space when she came home late. Nothing had changed, or at least that's what he thought. The next morning, he woke up to something unexpected. His phone, which usually remained silent aside from the occasional text from his one real friend Noah, was buzzing nonstop. Notifications flooded his screen. Messages, missed calls, and a social media explosion he couldn't make sense of. His name was everywhere. Jake Stevens. People were talking about him. A video had surfaced. Someone in the crowd had filmed it, the moment he chased after the drawing and handed it back to Barron Trump. The caption read, "A small act of kindness can change everything." The post had gone viral overnight. Millions of views. Thousands of comments. News outlets had picked it up, calling him the kid who showed kindness in a world that often forgets it. People praised him, saying things like, "Faith in humanity restored," and "We need more kids like this." But along with the praise came something else. Scrutiny. Jake had never been in the spotlight before. He wasn't prepared for it. Suddenly, strangers were digging into his life, commenting on things they didn't understand. Some assumed he had done it for attention. Others questioned his background, his intentions. And then, there were those who mocked him, because that's what the internet does. His mom noticed before he even had a chance to bring it up. She stood in the kitchen, staring at her phone, the news playing on the tiny TV they kept above the fridge. Her face was a mix of worry and something else, something Jake couldn't quite read. "You okay?" she finally asked. "I guess." She hesitated, then placed a hand on his shoulder. "You didn't do anything wrong." He knew that. But why did it feel like everything was changing in a way he couldn't control? And then came the call. At first, he thought it was a joke, a random number from New York. He almost didn't answer, but when he did, the voice on the other end was calm, professional, and very real. "Hello, Jake. My name is Daniel. I work with the Trump family. Barron would like to meet you." Jake's mind went blank. Why? What could Barron Trump possibly want with him? The following weekend, Jake found himself back in the city, standing outside a private entrance to a building that looked more expensive than anything he had ever seen. His hands were stuffed into his pockets, trying to hide how nervous he was. A black car had picked him up from his neighborhood, making him feel like he had stepped into a different world. The door opened, and there he was. Barron. He wasn't surrounded by security this time, just one man standing off to the side. Dressed casually in a hoodie and sneakers, Barron looked less like the figure from the media and more like just another kid. "Hey," he said, offering a small smile. "Hey," Jake replied. They sat in a quiet lounge, and for a moment neither of them spoke. It was strange, two teenagers from completely different worlds, thrown together because of a moment neither of them had planned. "I wanted to say thanks," Barron finally said. "For the drawing," Jake shrugged. "It wasn't a big deal." "It was to me." Barron hesitated, then pulled something from his pocket. It was the same drawing, but now it had been carefully smoothed out and placed in a protective sleeve. Jake raised an eyebrow. "Must be important." Barron nodded. "It is. I drew it for my grandfather. He loved sketching buildings. Thought maybe I could carry that on." Jake hadn't expected that. He had never thought much about what Barron's life was really like, beyond what the world assumed. Barron leaned back. "You don't seem like the kind of person who enjoys all this attention." Jake huffed a small laugh. "That obvious?" "Yeah." There was something refreshing about the honesty. No pretense, no walls, just two kids who had been caught up in something bigger than themselves. Then, Barron did something unexpected. He pulled out his phone and showed Jake a message. "My dad saw the video. He thinks what you did says a lot about who you are." Jake tensed. "What does that mean?" Barron smirked. "He wants to help you." Jake blinked. "Help me?" "He does that sometimes. Finds people who, I don't know, deserve a chance." Jake didn't know how to respond. This was surreal. A week ago, he was just another kid trying to get through the day. Now he was sitting across from Barron Trump, being offered some vague opportunity that didn't feel real. "What if I don't want help?" he asked cautiously. Barron studied him for a moment. "Then say no." Jake looked around the room, at the quiet luxury of it all, and thought about his tiny apartment, his mom working late shifts, the weight of everything he had learned to accept as just life. For the first time, he wondered if maybe, just maybe, he had been given a door to something different. But was he ready to walk through it? And if he did, would he regret it? Jake sat there, staring at Barron, unsure of what to say. The offer was hanging in the air between them, unspoken but undeniable. Help. A chance at something different. A way out of the life he had always and known. But was it really that simple? He thought about his mom, working 2 jobs just to keep their small apartment. He thought about the days he skipped lunch at school because money was tight. He thought about how, no matter how hard he tried, life always felt like it was holding him back. Jake exhaled slowly. What kind of help? Barron leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. I don't know all the details. My dad just said he wants to help. Maybe a scholarship, maybe connections, something to get you to where you want to be. Jake hesitated. It felt too good to be true. And yet, Barron didn't seem like he was playing a game. There was no pity in his voice, no sense that he was looking down on Jake. It was just an offer. You don't have to decide right now, Barron added, but I think you should at least think about it. That night, Jake lay awake in his bed, staring at the cracks in the ceiling. He had always believed that life was just something you endured. You worked with what you had, and if things were tough, you just pushed through. But now, for the first time, he was being given something more, a choice. A week passed before Jake got the call again. This time, it wasn't Barron. It was a man with a serious voice, offering to arrange a meeting. They wanted to introduce him to people who could open doors for him. Jake still wasn't sure what to say, but something inside him told him to go, the May. Next weekend, he found himself sitting in an office that looked like something out of a movie. It was high up in a building overlooking the city, the kind of place that made him feel small. Across from him sat a man who had seen more of the world than Jake ever would. A businessman, a name that carried weight, someone who had built an empire. Jake was nervous, but he refused to show it. You did something good, the man said, watching him closely. Not because you wanted anything, but because it was the right thing to do. Jake swallowed. Yeah, that says a lot about who you are. Jake didn't know how to respond. He wasn't used to people noticing him, let alone talking to him like he mattered. The man leaned back. I want to help, but not just by throwing money at you. I want to give you something better. Opportunity. Jake sat up a little straighter. Like what? A future, the man said simply. Education, mentorship, the kind of guidance that can change everything. Jake's mind raced. It was overwhelming, almost too much to process. But then he thought about his mom, about how hard she worked, about how much she had sacrificed, and he thought about Barron, about that moment when he had looked at Jake like he was more than just a random kid on the street. Jake took a breath. Okay, he said finally. I want to try. The next few months were unlike anything he had ever imagined. He was connected to people who saw his potential, who helped him figure out what he wanted in life. He worked harder than ever, pushing himself in ways he never had before. And for the first time, he felt like he was moving forward, not just surviving, but actually building something for himself. But the biggest surprise came later, when he least expected it. One evening, his mom came home with tears in her eyes. Not from exhaustion, not from stress, but from something else entirely. She held up an envelope. Jake, they offered to pay for your college. Jake's heart stopped. What? She nodded, voice shaking. A full ride. Everything covered. They believe in you. Jake didn't know what to say. He had spent his whole life assuming he'd never have that chance. That college was just a dream too far out of reach. But now, because of one small act, one moment of kindness, it was real. Months passed. Life changed. Jake stayed in touch. With Barron, though their lives were still worlds apart. They texted sometimes, talked occasionally, but there was an understanding between them. "You ever think about that day?" Jake asked once. Barron smirked. "Every now and then." Jake laughed. "Crazy how one small thing can change everything." Barron nodded. "Yeah, but you know what? I think you would have found your way either way." Jake wasn't sure if that was true, but he liked to believe it, and as he stood there, looking at the future ahead of him, he realized something. Kindness wasn't just about a single moment. It was a ripple effect. One small act could open doors, change lives, and lead to places you never imagined, and for Jake, it had done exactly that. The end.